Welcome, citizens of the globe, to the Frontend Heroes podcast, where we discuss all things villainous and heroic about the front end of software development. My name is Evan Payne, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Scott Francis. How are you doing, Scott?
Really good, thank you. Looking forward to doing a pod, and just looking forward to hearing a little bit, spoiler alert, but looking forward to hearing about a new technology from you.
Yeah, I hope we can talk about a broad range of subjects. Today's episode is sponsored by NetCentric, an award-winning Adobe Global Alliance partner. Both Scott and I work here as senior front-end software engineers, and we are so glad as ever to have their support with this show. So the theme of today's show, the tongue-in-cheek superhero reference is masks, gloves, and cape. Mask, gloves, and cape. In any case, the reference is, of course, to putting on your costume, dressing things up, and what better for that than talking about CSS, in particular the accoutrements we use to develop our CSS. So I'm thinking of libraries, whether they're good or they are bad. I'll start us off talking about one of the first times that I really thought about CSS as having a library, and that was maybe not the first, but still using Suzy. Suzy is a grid system. It's since the creator of it has recommended to stop using it. But in any case, I think we still use it quite frequently. And just as an overview, it gives you a number of predefined classes that you can use to construct a grid. So columns and rows and such. So you can size your thing appropriately, and media queries as well. Scott, what's been your experience with that? Where has it helped you? How has it sort of fallen apart at times, etc.?
Firstly, it feels like kind of odd to be talking about something like Suzy when it's like as though somebody coming to web development now would be not considering using it, because it is kind of it is defunct effectively. It's stopped being supported by the guys who made it. But the first time I experienced this was back when I was working for a company in the UK, and it was really at the start of what I think of as like my journey in actual web development. I'd worked on projects before, but the need for grid layouts was kind of something that had previously passed me by, and so. Then, of course, I remember back then there was lots of discussions about how to put a grid together. There was people at the company who wanted to make their own grids. Was this the right approach? There was debates for hours. And then Suzy was like the oasis in the desert. It was like, we can actually implement this with the project, and we can configure it, and we don't need to have a proprietary grid that we don't all agree on. We're just going to use this. And I have to say that when we put that into a project and started using it, it kind of felt revolutionary. And like it seemed, I think the initial config, the initial getting used to it and how things actually worked with it, took a little bit of getting used to. But then I have the feeling that it kind of became ubiquitous. It kind of became, everybody was using Suzy. It was like, it was the go-to for a lot of projects. And as you mentioned, even though its support has been taken away from it and it's not really going to be developed anymore, thanks to advances in CSS, it is something that you'll still find, like young developers coming into the industry today, working on projects that are not even really like legacy projects, but just mature projects. They would still encounter that. So I think it's left a big footprint.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the project that I just wrapped up on, I'd been working on it for about a year, a little less, and the other developers had been another year before that as well. That had Suzy because that was our standard. And when I got in, it was fine. It worked, but it was a little, actually, I found it hard. The abstraction of what the actual grid was doing was a little too much for me. When I wanted to make sure that a particular subcomponent was on that grid, or worse, even change the actual like content width and adapt the margins appropriately, it started to get into this territory where like, this is doing too much. It's too much magic under the hood for me. I think that's a term I use with a lot of libraries where they do abstract something away, and you don't actually see what happens. It just kind of works. That's magic, right? For me, it always had a little too much of that because I didn't understand. So I took the time when I got into this project to go in and understand what was happening under the hood. And like with most libraries, I found there was too much that I didn't need there. So I just took the bits I needed, put them into my own sort of mix-in in Sass, and then I had a much simpler grid system based off of SUSE, but that, it required me to be a little more explicit about what I was writing, percentages and stuff, but it gave me greater flexibility for the project I was working on. And I think that's what we'll see as a lot of legacy projects, even like Moment, right? This is back over to JavaScript, but that's also, they said, we're not going to work on this anymore. Start to migrate over to solutions that work better for you. I still think you need a library for dates, but you can take some piecemeal bits. You don't have to include the whole thing. If the library is not tree shakeable, especially, you should take piecemeal. Same thing can be done with CSS.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I mean, I think in general, the problem with frameworks is that you do tend to find that you're going to get a lot more than you actually need. And yeah, I guess that probably is the case for SUSE. Honestly, I've never done what you just described. I've never gone into it and found, okay, so like these are the bits that I don't need. So I'm going to take the good bits, if you like, or the relevant bits. I suppose it's all good, just perhaps not all relevant. So yeah, I think that's really like to take it the way that you've done as a starting point, and taking a look at how you can actually manipulate that for your own project and make that better, or make that less bloated, is a really good approach. But I mean, in general, with SUSE, like I found that when we started using it, that it did settle a lot of arguments. It allowed us to put a grid system into projects and follow like a standard. So every developer knew that we were using this, and so learn how to use this, and the layout is not going to be a problem.
Yeah, and I think that's the important part about these CSS libraries. What they usually are is a way to set a standard so that you can get up to speed developing your code much faster. And one of the first examples of this, I think, was Bootstrap, along with Foundation. That was another one that also provided a similar service. But Bootstrap is arguably more well-known, and it is basically a set of CSS classes, pre-baked CSS that's rendered that you can add in classes to your HTML, and then you don't have to write the styles for a card, a hero image, a grid or a container, or certain widths, or any of this sort of stuff. It's all pre-built for you, and then you just plop it in. And you can do overrides as well. The library has matured significantly over the years. You can not just customize the colors, but override a component completely or just part of it, set your spacings, etc. But in the end, when you run your build, it then generates the CSS that you need, and probably a lot of extra CSS, and you have your system ready to go where you can add in, and you end up writing less CSS as a result, right?
Yeah.
Have you used that on any of your projects?
I used it only once to do like a side project. Experimented with it a little bit, but I have to say that I've always been. One thing I am always is impressed with the amount of work that goes into things like this, and the opportunity that it gives to people to actually develop things like fairly quickly, and sometimes like fairly complex things. So I have been impressed by Bootstrap, and I used it once in a side project. But for me, I think maybe this is because it was a few years ago. Maybe things have got better, but it was the amount of CSS that was going into the project that I found to be the blocker for me. You could do so much. You could have so many components, but if you didn't have all of those components, I still found that it was generating like a lot of CSS, which I didn't need. And I think that it's okay to, how you described using Suzy, where you went in and you really looked and saw the parts that you needed and kind of extrapolated those. I think to do that every time for something like Bootstrap would be too much of a barrier for me. I think the genius of things like this is for like prototyping, for getting things up and running real fast, for doing proof of concepts and things like that. Like the speed with which you could work when you're not concerned really about like so much about the performance of something. You just want like quick development to prove that something could look good, could work. A user journey could be what you wanted it to be, could be what the customer wanted it to be. I think that's a real bonus of something like this. But to consider using it for production, I think the task would be harder, so to say.
Yeah. And I mean, I can give another example. It's not quite Bootstrap, but there's this framework for Vue called Vuetify, which we used for that same thing. We were on a sort of project that, it offers you chances to restyle. So, you have a set of like a tab group where you have it look a certain way. You can change that enough, but the HTML and the JavaScript parts of it are kind of the magic, right? You just import this component library, and then you use the vtab group, and you put in your tabs as vtabs as well. So how it works is under the control of the library, and you don't have functionality over. You can restyle it a little bit, make it do what you want. And that's great at first. But then you start using it for as much as you can. You just instinctively say like, okay, well, I need a container. I'll use vcontainer. I need a card. I'll use vcard. And then it comes to the bit where you want to upgrade your library to Vue 3 because that just came out. And you start looking, and Vuetify doesn't support Vue 3 yet. I'm sure it will, but in the meantime, we wanted to get this done and didn't want to wait. And we were stuck because we couldn't refactor. Everything was so tightly integrated with how they had set up of doing it. Even if we wanted to, let's say, change the way the tabs functioned somehow, we couldn't have done that. It's sort of pre-baked, and then you have to reinvent it, which is hard too. So this is getting into more JavaScript for sure, but it's the same principle. Yeah, it can be really difficult when a library gives you not enough customization options to generate a small amount of code. There's a toss-up between the two. I've heard that a lot, and yeah, it's easy to get burned by that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that it's like a really valid example. And there's with things like this, there's obviously ways that you can actually customize this and make it work in the real world. It's just that you kind of have to weigh up the investment of time against the advantages of actually having like the pre-baked code, the pre-baked CSS in this example. But I mean, for sure, there's a place for these things. For me, I've always seen the advantage is the speed with which you can work.
So the problem of having it sort of production ready, right? They've addressed it, right? I mean, in Bootstrap, they make sure that you can only import what you need and you don't have to take everything in. They've gotten much more modular in that sense. But you still do end up with a lot of CSS because there's no kind of the CSS version of tree shaking, right? They just assume if you're importing a button, you need all the button classes. And while you can customize the colors and stuff, it's not always that easy. I'm not by any stretch trying to poo-poo on Bootstrap. I think it has a place in the world, and it is continuing to get better. But while looking into this and thinking about it, even like 2 years ago, Bootstrap offers some utility classes. And so utility CSS as a kind of global term is this concept of, well, I don't want to repeat myself too frequently. I know, let's say as an example, that if I want to give something a margin bottom of 10 pixels, then somewhere I will define what 10 pixels is on my like numeric scale, but then I would just write as a class MB dash, let's say 5. Well, that's probably too much, whatever. But you pick some number that represents 10 pixels. And then somewhere in your class, you say that the MB-5 class is equal to is margin bottom 10 pixels. So then anywhere you write that class, you just get margin bottom 10 pixels. Bootstrap has some of those. But then there was a framework that came up recently that was all those. And they encourage you to make all your CSS that. I mean, this started ages ago, right? There was, I think, one that was called Tachyons. Atomic CSS in general is this concept of one class per CSS rule. And the first time that I experienced that, it was horrifying. It's just like your HTML gets cluttered with classes, and it just felt like overkill for when you were trying to develop a certain way. And I don't know exactly what changed, but then this framework called Tailwind came along, and I gave it a chance. I saw a talk by someone online, and they were demoing it, and I was like, okay, let's try this. And about, 2 days into it, I was like, this is amazing. I wish I could use this on all of my projects.
Well, I have to say, I've seen you tweeting about this and getting excited about this. I have read a little bit about it, but I am, for all intents and purposes, green to this. So would you be able to talk us through like how this works and what you found are like the real advantages? Because it seems like, as I said, I've seen your tweets, and I get the feeling that you're like really into this as a way of working.
Yeah. Okay. So let's take like a login component as an example. One of the things that you use a lot across the website, and one of the reasons that actually got me interested in it was I like using Flexbox for my layouts. And as I was developing this login component for a standalone site, I noticed that I was writing in my CSS file in different class groups, rule sets. I was writing display flex, flex direction row or column, whatever is not the default, and justify items left or flex start or something like that, right? I was repeating these same properties over and over in the CSS, and that cluttered up the CSS. It made it harder to read, and wasn't really that important to separate it. And once I was like, okay, let's say this utility first CSS, all of those get moved into the HTML. So I would have div, which is class flex, items center, justify center, border B2, border white, padding bottom for margin y-axis 12. And all of a sudden, just by writing that line, which, it takes a little bit, but once it gets into your head that that's the way you write things, that was all done. And once I finished redoing this login component, there was no CSS that was left, because nothing of this was so specific that I'll put it another way. I didn't need to reuse any of this CSS, which is to say I wrote very specific CSS just for this particular layout component, etc. I'd already had it as a component, so if I needed to reuse it, I would reuse the component, not the CSS. So this idea that we write classes so that we can reuse them didn't matter anymore. And then also the CSS that comes along with it isn't opinionated. So yes, the colors are there and the initial padding, but you can override that really quickly when you set up your configuration. So you determine what PB4, padding bottom 4 is. It doesn't have to be 4 pixels. It can be 12 pixels if that is what your scale is. And then white could be, the actual text of white could be sort of an off-white if you wanted to be that as well. But it's your system. It's your app that you're developing. It's not theirs, right? One of the I'm talking too much, but one of the things that people said in Bootstrap back in the day was that you could tell if it was a Bootstrap site. And that was because there were so many things to configure that you just didn't do it. And then you looked like every other Bootstrap that came out of the box. In this, it's pretty bare bones. In fact, There's a very small reset like we have on most projects that you include. There's a few helper things for layouts, and the rest of it is just a rule for each CSS class. So there's one class for Flex, there's one for Item Center, one for Border Bottom 2, that kind of stuff. Again,
so
I was really, yeah.
So how do you actually configure this then? How do you actually get this set up in the first place?
Yeah, so you need to use Post CSS as a loader in your process. So if you're using Webpack, you need a Post CSS loader. If you already have a way to set up Post CSS, you set it up in there, and you include the Tailwind as part of the pipeline for your building. So you do the Post CSS import, you do Tailwind, and you do Auto Prefixer. And then you have a Tailwind config file, which lets you set up like the theme. So you can either overwrite the existing color names, or you can create a brand new one. You can change the margins and paddings and like the spacings in general. And you can add other stuff like, what I did in this project was I added already a default font family. So instead of having to have the font names that I required written out every time I'd wanted, I could just say, add apply font family title. And then it would just get the font that it needed to. Things like that ended up being quite helpful. The other magic of this has been, at least in VS Code, there is now autocomplete. So once you set this up and you have the extension for Tailwind configured, it reads your config, it knows what you've overwritten or what you've created as new, and when you start typing into your HTML, like class equals this, it gives you options of everything. So I don't have to memorize. That was the other problem with a lot of frameworks. You have to memorize what their utility classes are called. But I start typing border, and it shows me all the variations and all the colors that I could apply to that border, which really speeds things up too.
Yeah, that's nice. I think that's from what you're telling me. I think that kind of thing is going to be essential for the speed of use of something like this. So Tailwind doesn't have. So it's more utilities. It's not. It doesn't have like its own components like Bootstrap, for instance. It doesn't have like a button component or a card component or anything like that. It's different to that, right?
Definitely, yeah. And that's the other thing I like as well, because once you use one of these components that they have, you're locked into the HTML structure, right? You kind of have to do it the same way they do it, or the children parts of that don't work. And at the end of the day, you end up not writing CSS, and you have a lot less control. This, because it's all utilities, you only write the CSS you need, but you only write it in the HTML. That's like the only real difference. So you don't end up with a lot of repetition. Yeah, there is some of it for sure that goes into the HTML. That's gzipped away. And while it would have also been gzipped away in the CSS files, it is, again, it's easier to read because you're looking directly at the element in the HTML. So all your work is in the same place. It's a huge mindset shift for sure. And again, it took some while to get over the idea that this is not right somehow. You still have to write CSS. There are going to be times where you need to do something more complex. I'm going to find a specific example in front of me in my library here, but like I needed to, like there was a certain kind of button I wanted to use multiple places, and I didn't want it to write font bold, padding 2, padding top 2, padding horizontally 4, rounded, and then when you focus, outline none and give it a shadow. And then if it's a primary button, give it this color and this text font. Like I didn't want to have to write that every single time I use a button. So I created a class specifically for that for my project. But I used a special thing they have inside CSS, which is @apply, or inside your Sass CSS file, SCSS files. So @apply, and then you give it the same sort of thing. So I'm using the same rule sets under the hood of this to build out these classes. So if I were to change the definition of, say, like what px4 is, what the spacings, what 4 represents in that thing, this would just inherit it, and I wouldn't need to make any changes. And that, for me, is the other thing. There's a single place where you configure these important site-wide things like colors and spacings. It's not really obfuscated and hidden and magic like some other places.
No, that sounds really nice. Like to actually have the ability to affect everything just by changing the config file. I think that is really good. I think it's kind of it's something that we've all like tried to do. We've always tried to use config files, right? In our SAS, so that we have that advantage. So it's nice that you can use this in combination with that as well. And it sounds a really useful tool for any front end hero. So the question is, you've been using this for a while now. Do you think that you would push to use this in a client project, like in the next 6 months? Do you think that it would take like a year? Do you think that it would depend on the type of project that you're working on?
Yeah, like I just started in on a new project, and it seems like it would be a really good place to use it, but it's I couldn't recommend it because it is meant to be, it's a component library sort of thing. So what we're building is then meant to be used by other people. And you do get a bunch of lock-in, right? If you're writing your CSS this way and you want someone else to use it, they also have to use it, right? I guess that's the benefit of writing your CSS inside the components. Then if you do somehow share that component as a web component or something, it's done. It's locked into place. So yeah, for this project, I just couldn't recommend it. But if I was starting a brand new, like, hey, make us this marketing website or whatever it is, yeah, I would. On our internal projects, when we've started new things, I said, okay, we're starting this new thing. Let's use Tailwind for this. On my own side projects as well, I've said, no, I'm all in on this. I'm just going to use this from now on until something better comes along. But it's pretty good. It's pretty conscientious about how it works. The last thing I want to mention is the sort of tree shaking aspect of it, which I think Bootstrap, this can be done with there, but there's a post CSS plugin, I think it's runs in other ways as well, called Purge Css. And what that does is at the end of your build process, once you've generated all of the files that are going to be running, it scans through looking for the class names that have been in this main file it's generated. So it says, okay, did you use padding Y or PY2, right, anywhere? And if it can't find that anywhere in your existing HTML or JavaScript, it removes that rule from the CSS bundle. So that's super useful. In particular, it provides you like media queries, responsive design things, and you end up with all of the CSS you wrote is duplicated for the number of breakpoints that you have. So when you first do it, if you don't have any Purge CSS, that file is humongous, right? It's scarily large. But the actual rendering, the build process then, and this Purge CSS can shrink it down to like only a few kilobytes if that's all you used as far as the CSS classes go and you didn't use any breakpoints.
Okay, so that seems like a really, like, to use Tailwind, it seems like a really important step for anybody who was actually thinking of using this.
Yeah, it is. I mean, another trick is to don't use your media queries for all of your classes, but you don't know which ones you're going to need. And if you even have one breakpoint set, it'll automatically generate those classes. Same thing for hover styles, for focus styles. You need to turn them on for certain components or certain types of classes that you use. So they're not all on by default, but those also balloon the file size. So having this is pretty important, this control over it. And it's a little intimidating because sometimes you get it wrong, but there is a kind of safe list where you can put in ones that you don't want to delete. And it makes you rethink. This is the one place where I would say I'm not totally happy, right? When you create something that's dynamic, let's say like the button inherits its color from, I don't know, some variable that's passed in, an input property, right? You don't know what that input property is going to be. So you write in your code, I want this to be text dash and then the color name, but as a variable. Now, Purge CSS doesn't know which one you have. So it will not give you all the colors if you haven't written that manually anywhere in the CSS. So in that case, it doesn't actually work, you actually have to like safe list the colors so that it will generate all the colors regardless. That's not ideal. And in fairness, you should have done that anyway, right? If you have a color, you're probably going to use it at some point. But still, it's not ideal. Instead, you would need to do like a switch statement. So you manually write out text blue, text red, text green. And then it can find it and make sure that it's not shaken away.
Yeah, I take your point. I mean, it's a good example. And I think that it's a combination of two things. Like one, yes, you would need to configure like a safe list, and when you're developing, realize that you're going to need to safe list something. But also, just taking care to not write CSS which you're not gonna that isn't going to be used. I mean, I think it's which is sometimes harder than you actually think. You might miss something. You did need it, and now you don't need it, and so it should be taken out. But yeah, it's like a combination of if you do two things. If you're always looking at, do I actually need this when you're writing it, or refactoring or anything like that. But with the safe list as well, I think you should be in a pretty good position.
I don't know. I guess it's the biggest thing that makes it feel empowering. So it's the autocomplete, so that you don't have to continually go and look things up. Because, there is a difference. You've memorized instinctively over time. You've memorized all of the rule sets: display, : flex, display, : inline flex. The dev tools helps with that as well. But having that not having that in the HTML, and on top of that, those are all translated into someone chose a name for it. It's not display flex, right? It's flex. It's not margin 0 auto. It's MX auto, something like that. Uh-huh. Having that as autocomplete makes it flow naturally. You sometimes have to guess a little bit, but since you have the list that comes up when you start typing, or the autocomplete there, it makes it really easy. And then the other thing is being in the HTML where you're saying, okay, well, now I need a child element here that is going to be sort of positioned here, and it needs to grow, flex grow 0 or something like that. You just write that as you're creating that HTML element in the class name. So your creation and styling is just done hand in hand. That is really actually impressive, and it feels really good. And you're done with things way faster than you think. Anyway, I definitely am a bit of a fanboy at this stage. We'll see as I use it long term what the side effects are, but I know it's going well so far.
Yeah, you've convinced me. I'm keen to take a look at it. I have a little project coming up as well, so it could be a good opportunity to take a look at this. I think it sounds really good. It sounds, and if development can get faster, but the output is still small, or at least like only what you need it to be, which it sounds like it can be. Then why not? Let's give it a go. I'm sure other people will as well. It's good to try these things.
Yeah, absolutely. With anything, it's good to try. I was surprised that, for example, we are moving over this internal project to Vue 3, and I hadn't really come back to Vue in a while. I'd been using Angular, and I'd done Vue in the past. I did like it, but I wasn't as fast, and in Angular I was pretty fast. But coming to Vue 3 with its composition API, I was like, oh, I actually enjoy this. I'm pretty fast at this. Okay, that might have just been because I learned JavaScript better in the meantime, but it's good to try these new things and then keep yourself fresh.
Yeah, for sure. It's nice to have like new projects to work on and get the opportunity. I mean, there's always opportunity with Frontend. So you can always do something new.
We're getting closer to the end, but the last thing I wanted to touch on is you don't always need anything. Right. For a while, we used SUSE and Bootstrap to cover our grid systems. But now in the Evergreen browsers, at least, if you don't have to support older ones, you can use CSS grid. It's part of the spec. It's in the process now. And while that is maybe a little hard to pick up, so was Flexbox back in the day, and people that have learned that now just use it instinctively. Grid, I think, will eventually become the same thing. So, have you used Grid yet?
I totally, well, I'd say I totally agree. I think that like, you don't always need these things. And the reasons that we did need them before was because we didn't have the capabilities for this. In a project, I've not actually used Grid, but I have learned about it, and I have taught some classes about Grid in the academy that we run once a year. Been very impressed with it. I think that Grid in combination with Flexbox does all the things that we've always wanted to be able to do, basically. The things that we've like always used other tools for are now available for us, like just directly from the browser. And I think that I would definitely urge people to take a look and to actually become familiar with Grid. The reason that I haven't actually gone down that route is because I am still mainly working on a project which requires support from IE11, and it's a legacy project, and I think that there becomes a point where to switch over would be a huge task, and perhaps not the best use of people's time, but the tools are definitely there now, and we become more and more aware of them as time goes on. Lots of talk on Twitter, lots of talk in conferences, things like that, where this information comes out, and we become aware of like the things that we can actually do with it. And I have to say, the younger generation of people coming along now, these are the tools that are always they would just be your go-to, because this is exactly like they're available. Why would you use anything else? It's only for people who've been in the industry a little longer, like myself and you, where we would actually remember the old ways of doing things. Like I think they'll just fade away, and the native support will gain the traction that it deserves.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've used it on. So in the project I was working on previously, where we had been working on it for a number of years and we're using Suzy, at a certain stage, the client dropped support for IE11, which is great. And I started using, at least in the new parts of the project, CSS variables or custom properties and Grid, but I didn't redo the whole thing. So I didn't like replace the Grid system entirely because it was working and I didn't want to mess with it. And until subgrid is implemented, it's not always that useful for larger layout for me. I find myself using it more for inside components, just when I say, okay, look, in the space that's available here, let's set up a little mini grid. And I don't even always use it for rows. I mostly use it for columns, and when I want things to lay on top of each other and I don't want to use float because I want the heights to remain consistent. And just in small ways, I'm just starting to sprinkle it in because, again, I don't know the full syntax. I'm not doing grid areas. There's a lot of shorthand as well, which in some ways is nice, but also is a lot. And so there's 4 ways to do it. It starts to feel like, software engineering. In any case, it's cool. It does work. And the more you sprinkle these things in, the better you'll get at them over time. You'll find what works for you and how you prefer to use it.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think that the way that Flexbox has been taken up is an example of like just the mindset shift. Gradually it creeps in, and now like we just use Flex all the time. For laying out components, it's just it was a revelation, to be honest, as soon as we could actually use that, and you could actually position things the way that you instinctively wanted to. And I think that like gradually Grid will come in the same way. I already see that there's some like with the dev tools in Firefox, for instance, with the support for Grid, is just makes things really really nice to develop with. And I think that I saw on Twitter not long ago that DevTools in Chrome was going to have similar support. So yeah, I think like the opportunity to use it and become really accustomed to it is just around the corner.
Yeah, for sure. And I would make a call out as well to custom properties here, because I started using those. And, you think that it's just Sass, but it's not. There's more you can do with it. And there's some really interesting use cases. So maybe we'll spend another show just talking about that.
Yeah, we definitely should. They like. I just wanted to say then they're like, I've touched on custom properties and been really, really impressed with them. I think when the penny actually drops that, oh, this isn't like just adding another variable like in your Sass. This isn't. It's more than this. The ability to manipulate your layouts with this. When the penny drops, it's like, oh wow, that is really impressive. Like, I want to start using those. So definitely, yeah, we should perhaps take a look at those in the future.
Good. So as we start to wrap up, we want to go back to our regular segment now, True Heroes. In this segment, we want to highlight a few of the true front-end heroes that are working across the planet and to thank them for all that they do. So, Scott, you had a recommendation this time around.
Yeah, I did. And it fits in with the CSS theme that we've had this time around. I'd like to give a shout out to Rachel Andrew. Now, Rachel is somebody who came and actually talked at a conference which NetCentric ran a few years ago, and I think she talked about CSS Grid. And it was to be honest, that was the first introduction that I had to this. I was hugely impressed with her. She spoke so well, and followed her on Twitter. She is constantly speaking somewhere, constantly providing knowledge, constantly updating content, pushing it out to the community. She does a lot of work to develop standards. She's just somebody who is always available for the community, always working for the community and trying to make things better. And it seems to me, I don't know her personally, but it seems to me that she has such a passion for this, that she is definitely somebody who is always worth listening to. If you see her listed to speak at a conference, then you know that you're going to take something from that. So yeah, I just wanted to give a shout out to Rachel Andrew as a true front-end hero.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant pick. I mean, again, at our company summit, she came and gave a talk on Grid kind of a few weeks before it was released, I think. And there was two things that struck me. One was that, yes, the talk was excellent and was explained to us in a way that made us understand what we were missing out by not having it. And two, that someone could actually go into the CSS working group and push this forward. So this had been in spec for quite a while, but she took her time and made sure that all the questions were answered and got it to a point where the browsers could start to implement it. For example, the reason that IE11 support for Grid is kind of there is because it had been in the spec phase for a while, but now it became a standard, and it was like, okay, now it's recommended to implement, and they did it, like Firefox and Chrome and the rest. So that was also very empowering to realize that this is something in your career that you can do, especially the more knowledge you have, the more experience you have, and you can see what people are missing in the language, you can push it forward. And you see that with, Una Kravitz and a few others that are pushing forward these standards and changing the way their browsers actually implement them. The other thing I wanted to mention is that, yeah, she's also super clever because she's now editor-in-chief of Smashing Magazine. She sort of took over, I don't know, a year or two ago from Vitaly Friedman there, and also, again, providing the community with the knowledge that it needs to push forward. So definitely true hero within the space, and well done calling her out. So any proper hero is also a well-rounded one, and we, as usual, want to share some of our musical picks. So, Scott, what is the favorite thing you've been listening to lately?
I found that I'm listening to an awful lot of piano music at the moment. I think the end of lockdown and this whole period has needed me to get some kind of pieced out Zen listening in. So I've been listening to an album, it's a mini album called Summer Songs by a guy called David Vengren. Just stumbled upon him on Spotify, but honestly, just exactly what I need at the moment when I'm working. Just super chilled out. Just piano, nice. Some very nice piano music. No vocals or anything like that. But it's kind of just really like helping me to ease back into like what I would consider fairly normal living. So yeah, I would shout out to him. What about you?
Great. Yeah. From my side, it's a bit on the older side, but I do return to it frequently. The group is Hidden Orchestra. I would just tell you, start with the first album, Archipelago. And I'm reading through the bio, and Hidden Orchestra is actually mostly one guy who does all of the kind of producing, recording, etc. But he brings in different guest musicians from the tracks, gets them to record their bit, and then mixes it all together. So it's not really a full band. It's more of a thing. But I don't know how to explain it. When you listen to it, it is really, I don't know. It's fascinating sound, complex drum rhythms. It's jazzy in a certain way, but it's also very, I don't know, it has a certain mood to it. It's very hard to explain, like most of the picks I have, but it's really, really enjoyable. I think Archipelago is their second album, actually. Their first one as well. Either one, I'll put in the show notes. Worth checking out. So that's from my side. Cool. So it looks like that's all the time we have for today, folks. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you should like, heart, star us in your podcatcher of choice. These reviews and ratings are how the fancy algorithms help people find our content. We could use some more. So if you like it, please do so. Please. The power to help is within you. If you have any questions or topics you want covered in our next episodes, or if you just want to yell at us because Bootstrap does something we didn't think it did, send a tweet to us at Heroes Frontend. We'll add it to our list. And until next time, heroes, remember, with great front-end power comes great responsibility. See you next time.